Welcome to the Money Flow. I am Faaria Tasin, economist and host of this show, and today we are discussing the importance of the private sector in Bangladesh's economic growth. In only 50 years of its independence, Bangladesh has been a massive success. It is one of the fastest growing economies in the world with an enormous pool of young talent, and is going to be the 9th largest consumer market by 2030. Now, the private sector, with support from the government and the right set of policies, is going to be driving this growth and turn Bangladesh into a $1 trillion economy by 2040. To discuss more on this, we have Martin Holtmann, Country Manager of International Finance Corporation for Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Nepal. IFC is the largest global development institution focused on the private sector in developing countries. IFC, a member of the World Bank Group, advances economic development and improves the lives of people by encouraging the growth of the private sector in developing countries. IFC has been investing since 1985 and also provides a range of advisory services. Now let us go straight into the discussion. Martin, thank you so much for coming to my show.
Thank you, Faaria, for having me.
We are going to start off the discussion by mentioning what Bangladesh has going for itself. It is one of the fastest growing economies in the world, with an average GDP growth rate of 5%, actually over 5% for the last 30 years. Mm-hmm. And with a population of 170 million, we have an enormous domestic market. And according to Boston Consulting Group, 34 million people are expected to be in the middle income and affluent class by 2025. Now, to add to this, 68% of the population are in the working age category, and we have a young and trainable workforce where the median age is only 28 years. That is much lower than countries such as India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and even Thailand. Now, with all these positive attributes, where do you see Bangladesh in the next 10 years?
Thank you for the question, Faaria. And on a personal note, I'm super happy to be here. It's one of the most exciting places in the world for someone who's focused on development like I have been in my professional life. So it's super. I love it here. Before I go into the growth prospects of Bangladesh, let me just, if you allow me just a few minutes to talk about what IFC is and what we do. We are the private sector arm of the World Bank. We focus, as I said, totally on the private sector. We have a separate balance sheet. In a given year, we typically make commitments of around $30 billion a year for private sector activities.
Is it globally?
This is globally in about 100 plus countries. We cover all sectors, which means infrastructure, then the real sector, which is very important here in Bangladesh. I'll come back to that. And then, of course, the financial sector. And finally, disruptive technologies, because we're on the verge of a lot of disruption all around the world. So that's what we do. We also provide advisory services. We have been active in this country since 1985. We have a team of 60 plus people here. And so we are very, very focused on this market. Back to your question on Bangladesh. So indeed, Bangladesh is a poster child of successful development. As you pointed out, there's about 3 decades of very high annual growth, and not only annual growth of the economy, but also in terms of personal incomes. And that is, of course, important to keep in mind. There's a huge internal market that I think will only unfold over the next decades to reach a bigger height. And then the other thing I want to mention is not only has there been positive economic growth, but also socio-economic development. Poverty has gone down by a lot. Bangladesh leads South Asia in terms of female labor participation. Health indicators have improved a lot. Life expectancy has gone up rapidly over the last 20 years. It's now almost at the level of the United States of America, believe it or not. So those, I think, are real pluses.
And I think we've also done very well in education.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Primary education is now practically universal, and even the tertiary education rate has gone up to, I believe, about 16 or 17%. So that is, again, very promising for the future. So what will the future look like? Say 10 years, you asked about, let's say 10 years from now. I don't have a crystal ball. I can look at the past and try to project some big trends, and then of course also mix in perhaps some of the experience that we as IFC have in other similar countries and in other regions. And so one, I think there is a clear trajectory to really make it to the upper middle income status in less than 10 years from now, because our goal is 2031, as we all know, and I think the country is really on the path. And one doesn't have to be a genius like BCG to just look at the numbers. And if I just do the compounding of the growth rates, of course, I will reach a $1 trillion economy fairly soon. So that I think we're on a good path of reaching that. The other thing that I would predict that will happen is further differentiation. Differentiation of the products and services that Bangladesh is famous for, that Bangladesh exports, but also in terms of the domestic economy. And so you could maybe put that into a slogan to say beyond garments. Garments will of course be a big part of that journey, but I think we will also see activities beyond garments and light manufacturing, maybe export of bicycles, additional steel production, all those things. And I can give you more examples of that if time permits. So further differentiation. The next one I would mention, number 2, is consolidation. I think we see several industries where we have a big number of market players. Mm-hmm. And 10 years from now, I think we will see larger firms, but fewer firms. Example is the garment sector. I think we will not have 5,000 or so garment manufacturers anymore. It will be fewer than that. I think another example is the banking system. We have 31 banks right now, and even India only has 20 something. So I think we will see consolidation in that sector.
What will this consolidation imply? Is it going to imply higher efficiency?
So these may be mergers. These may also be some exits. Some companies may just close down. And the overall impact will be higher efficiencies and economies of scale. You're an economist. There are huge economies of scale in banking that we're not reaping right now. So fewer players tend to bring down the operating cost per player, and that's to the benefit of the consumer. We will also see additional economies of scope and product differentiation. So in other words, larger garment manufacturers, let's say that move from 800 million annual turnover to 5 billion, or whatever is the limit, I don't know, but they will tend to be more integrated, and they will have a bigger range of products that they can offer to the market. So consolidation is another trend that I would predict we will observe over the next 10 years. Digitalization, that's kind of like a no-brainer, because we're right in the middle of a rapid digitization around the world, and I have been impressed to see just how advanced the digital ecosystem in Bangladesh already is. Phone penetration is very high, even though smartphones have a lot of room to growth. Coverage of the phone system is very good, of the mobile network. That is actually an advantage of having a small country. So coverage is basically universal. We have an increasingly well-educated labor force that can work in what some people call the gig economy, but I prefer to call it the ICT economy. So we will see a lot more activity there with rising e-commerce companies, and possibly, I'm very excited about that, also digital banks. So those are just some of the elements, and at the end of the day, I hope we will see bigger incomes for everyone. So an inclusive economy, in the sense that everyone in society benefits from the economic growth. And on that one, I think we have seen a very convincing performance of Bangladesh over the last 30 years. And my hope and my expectation is that we will all stay focused on making sure that the increasing wealth is distributed to everyone in the economy.
That sounds great. Now, Martin, I would like to underscore the importance of manufacturing and exports for a country like Bangladesh. And Bangladesh is the second largest exporter of ready-made garments in the world, which is a great news for us. But product diversification is still quite low. 70% of the products that we produce are still quite basic. So I have two questions. Firstly, what are the opportunities for value chain enhancement in the ready-made garments industry? And secondly, we know that export diversification is a critical agenda for the government. What are the steps that we need to take to actually attain this?
So, as a German, I'm originally from Germany, I'm super impressed by the manufacturing excellence that I see here in this country, and that was counterintuitive to me. I did not expect to encounter such a great number of world-class factories and such an established ecosystem for what I would call very complex supply chains, because even a cotton shirt, if we call that a simple thing, is actually a very complex production system around it, with supply chains, with imported materials, with local processing, with wastewater treatment, with, of course, a lot of labor involved, and machines and electricity and everything. So once we start peeling the onion, it's actually a highly complex activity. Let me start with a little story about your question on differentiation. I actually think we're halfway there. I recently was in Germany. I needed to renew my passport, and I bought what by my standards fairly expensive dress shirt. And ever since I moved to Bangladesh, first thing I do is I look at the label, and I was very happy to see that this dress shirt was actually made in Bangladesh.
That's great to know.
And this was an upmarket, business label that I like to buy, and at least as I said, by my standards, not a cheap shirt.
So there is some value chain enhancement. But I think the quantity of it is still quite low.
Well, yes, I agree, and at the same time, it's very important to think of the signaling effect of these types of processes. So, to give you another example, I recently bought. I'm a passionate mountaineer, so I bought a down jacket from one of the really top labels in the United States, and I again did the same thing. I looked at the label inside, made in Bangladesh.
That's great.
I have also encountered in my regular factory visits, because IFC does invest in this space. And so we are currently providing funding and advisory services to a good number of leading garments manufacturers. And I encounter design teams from some of the top labels in the world, number one, and they come here and they work with their Bangladeshi partners on sportswear, on suits, for instance, which are, of course, all upmarket. And secondly, a good proportion of these clients already have their own in-house design teams, usually mixed between some Europe-based or US-based designers and then in-house design teams here in Bangladesh. And so all of this tells me that there is a lot of differentiation already going on. So when we look maybe at the total 5,000 garments manufacturers, maybe the majority in terms of numbers of them are still stuck at the lower end, but clearly the market leaders are moving upmarket and they're starting to capture a bigger part of the value chain. The other thing I would mention is they're moving away from simple cotton, and so we have a big trend now in the industry for man-made fibers, and I think there are quite a few manufacturers that are very active in that space already. Last but not least, very important to keep in mind, a reduction of waste and recycling. So that in itself is a massive opportunity for Bangladesh, because we used to export at least $400 million worth of garment waste to India to be recycled somewhere else and then to be re-imported as yarn back into Bangladesh. So breaking that cycle is a huge opportunity for the industry.
Now, I would like to point out that Bangladesh has the highest number of green garment factories. Mm-hmm. The last time I checked, it was 186. How do you think this is going to benefit the sector in the long run?
So the green element is increasingly part of the future of mankind, right? We're really at the point in our history as a species where we need to green and want to green everything we do. And so garments and clothes and textiles are just part of that. Of course, there is a never-ending demand for clothes for 8 billion people and still rising. So I'm not too worried about the demand situation for Bangladesh in the near future. And greening that and being climate friendly is, of course, part of the value proposition that we need to make in order for the consumer to want to purchase. And so I think that's a space where Bangladeshi entrepreneurs have been at the forefront of development. I think they quickly realized that this is not only important in itself in the sense of reducing the impact on our own natural resources here in this country. Of course, the resources are limited and it is a very small country, but also in terms of making it more attractive for consumers to buy Bangladeshi garments. And so in my view, it's a win-win-win situation. It's a win for the consumer, it's a win for the country here, for Bangladesh, and it's of course a win also for the manufacturers because their sales go up, and in that sense it's also a win for everyone else who is in the manufacturing cluster, including the workers. So this is an area that we at IFC are very focused on. We have been working for years in a program that we call PACT, the Partnership for Cleaner Textile. We have worked with almost 400 of the garments factories in an advisory capacity. The program has had a massive impact on an improvement in efficiency and reduction of waste. To give an example, every year 30 billion liters of water have been saved. Also 650,000 metric tons of carbon emissions have been eliminated. That's the equivalent of 100,000 cars on the road every year. So, and by and large, I think our partners, this has been in partnership with BGMEA, the Garments Manufacturers Association, and the partners have been very happy about this because they can literally see the results even in their own numbers in terms of having a more profitable production, which at the same time helps to protect the environment. So we're very happy with this. We're moving now into the next stage of this program, which will be an industrial decarbonization project that will also cater to other industries.
Okay. Now, Martin, let us talk about the agribusiness sector, which is a very promising sector. Now, Bangladesh is among the top 10 producers of rice, vegetables, fruits, and certain kind of farm fish. Now, according to an IFC study, 90 to 95% of the agriculture products are still sold unprocessed, which means only 5% is going for processing. What can be done to improve this situation, and how can we add value to our products?
In a nutshell, I would say it's a huge opportunity. Okay, it's actually almost the equivalent story that we just talked about in the garment sector, which is we want to capture a bigger part of the global value chain and make sure that the value that is created benefits Bangladesh and Bangladeshis. And so it's the same on the agricultural side. To start with, I think a very positive news is that agriculture has been one of the success stories of Bangladesh and of Bangladesh's development journey. When we compare today's situation with the history of Bangladesh, which also included some famines, the country has done spectacularly well on agricultural food production. You already mentioned the fact that the country is self-sufficient in rice production. No big surprise here because in the Middle Ages, the country produced about, what is today Bangladesh, produced about 70% of the world's paddy production at the time. So there's a proud tradition. And you have a good point about the lack of processing. That's something that some of our clients have identified and they're working on it. To give you an example, Pran, one of the leading food processors here, is a long-standing IFC client, and we have been working with them on food processing and in different categories. They now export to more than 100 markets. They're actively investing in food production capacity outside of Bangladesh, also even on other continents. We're very proud of that. We're trying to help wherever we can. This is something we actually really like seeing. Something that some people call South-South investments. I'm not sure it's a great term, but it really means that Bangladeshi entrepreneurs are going out and they're helping with the food supply in other countries based on the excellent experience here. The other thing I would mention is, of course, the fact that around the world we have a problem with food waste. A full 1/3 of all food that humans produce every year is wasted and is essentially just dumped as garbage. And that is, of course, a massive both environmental problem and, again, a big opportunity. So this is a space that we also are addressing with some of our partners. We're investing in cold storage, for instance. We also have other activities that help with the supply chain, and digitization, of course, will also greatly help. I think overall we need to, especially now that we have this crisis, this macroeconomic crisis, we need to keep in mind that uncertainty is the friend of the status quo. And this is something that is, I think economists call it the status quo bias. So many of us probably know that we've used the same toothpaste for the last 20 years. And even though there may be a better toothpaste out there, we just buy what we know, right? And so both in the garment sector and also in food processing, both of which are, I think, real growth areas for Bangladeshi entrepreneurs, we need to be mindful to not to become victim of the status quo bias and just to keep doing what we're comfortable with, right? And so that's something we like doing, is to show examples from maybe outside the country, also point out that there are emerging markets that are big opportunities for the entrepreneurs in order to keep innovating. And so that's something I think that we will also see in the food processing sector and in agriculture in general. Let me just, if you just allow me one more minute.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Speaking of rice, I just want to bring up one example of a very recent investment that IFC just made in rice production. We just recently approved the first ever investment under our global food security program, which is an answer, or at least a partial answer, to the current macro uncertainties. And so we approved an investment in a rice mill that will benefit the northern part of this country. This rice mill uses high-tech technology. It's a fully automated rice mill rather than the traditional husking process. And so this will not only reduce the environmental impact, but also help to improve the shelf life of rice. And so we're very proud of that as well. So we have a lot of activities in that space.
Okay, that's great to know. Now let's talk about infrastructure and logistics. And these are very important for a country like Bangladesh that has a huge manufacturing base. Now, also logistics subsectors such as ports, warehouses, ICDs, and temperature-controlled logistics are also very important for increasing the country's competitiveness. Now, if you look at Bangladesh's infrastructure financing needs, it's at $608 billion by 2040. On the other hand, public investment has been about 2% of GDP for the last 15 years. Now, this actually shows us that there is a huge opportunity, there's a huge financing gap, and a huge opportunity for the private sector to come in. How can IFC help in this space?
A very good question. And of course, no economy, and certainly no modern economy, can live without a world-class infrastructure. Point number one. And I think the good news is we're seeing a lot of infrastructure being built as we speak. Certainly
all
here in
around
Dhaka.
The country, actually.
Yeah,
yes.
Everywhere. Here in Dhaka, Potma Bridge, ports, airports, name it, it's there, where it's being constructed. Okay, so I think that one also needs to throw that into the picture, because it's not like the country doesn't have infrastructure. In fact, there is a lot of evolving infrastructure, and of course, the issue with infrastructure is always that it takes many years to build, and during those years, it's not very comfortable because the construction sites produce further disruptions of traffic. And we all know what I'm talking about here, and certainly anyone who lives in Dhaka. So is there enough funding for infrastructure right now? No. Clearly not. You mentioned the numbers, and in fact, there are estimates by our colleagues from the World Bank that the gap is at least another 2% of GDP, of annual GDP. So for the next 20 or 30 years, we would need to invest another 2% every year. I think that is too much of a stretch on current government fiscal resources, because of course there's many other areas that governments need to spend money on, education and whatever else, social services and so forth. So there's really no alternative except to move towards a bigger role of the private sector. I'm very pleased to see that there's a lot of openness in this country to consider these types of models. So this is something that IFC is heavily engaged in. Even as an advisor, to give you one example, we're working as an advisor on the Potenga terminal close to Chittagong.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? In what capacity are you working there?
So the advisory work is strictly limited to helping the operator and the owner of the terminal to get a better deal, right? So to the extent that they let in the private sector is to help negotiate the best deal for government. So that is what we do as an advisor. There may be other areas where we may also help with funding, and where we may come as partner of a consortium that would help to assist with one of those infrastructure projects. But the Potenga terminal that I just mentioned is a strictly advisory engagement. And again, the objective is to get the best deal for the government and for the people of Bangladesh, who at the end of the day are the government, right? Because they're the taxpayers. There are, of course, many aspects and areas of infrastructure, and we at IFC are not the best placed for every one of those. So there's many other development partners, like the World Bank, like some of the bilaterals, like also the Asian Development Bank. In IFC, we have focused traditionally on a few areas such as power production. So 20% of the private sector power supply in Bangladesh is being produced with IFC assistance. In
fact, a great number.
That is a very good number. We're very proud of it. In fact, I just visited 2 days ago a large power project, 670 megawatt project that is almost complete. With that has IFC funding in it. We're also, as part of the greening agenda, we're very focused now on climate-friendly power production. So we're currently looking at the first solar power plant, would be a 50 megawatt power plant. Of course, the sizes in solar are somewhat smaller, but we're excited about it. As part of the PACT program, by the way, we have been doing a lot of work on solar rooftops also, because there's a lot of space on top of the factories that can be used for solar production as well. The other part that we have been very active in on the infrastructure side is telecommunications. So we have helped several of the players in the telecoms industry here to build their networks, and we will continue to do that, because that is also part of the digitization journey. When it comes to cold storage and logistics, we're currently looking at that whole sector, and we're working on defining which areas of those are best suited for what IFC can bring to the table. So on that one, I hope to be able to share some news soon. But we're very excited about that whole sector. And again, no modern economy without the infrastructure. So this will remain a big issue for this country.
Martin, Bangladesh has recognized logistics as a priority sector, and this is a huge step in the right direction. And logistics subsectors such as ports, warehouses, temperature control logistics, and ICDs are very important for increasing the overall country's competitiveness. What is IFC doing in the logistics space?
You're right. Just like infrastructure is maybe the skeleton of a modern economy, the logistics you could call the cardiovascular system, because it really helps to produce energy and blood and oxygen to where it's needed, right? And in itself, it's probably the most complex part of any economy. And it's just fascinating to think of what it all takes to, for instance, to produce even a cotton shirt in terms of what goes in, where it's made, and then where it goes afterwards, right? And so that's, of course, the logistics sector. I'm very excited about the fact that government now declared the logistics sector as a priority industry. That was actually something that IFC was advocating for, and we had helped with a little bit of advisory assistance over the years. When I look at modern logistics sectors in other countries, they typically provide a big chunk of the national competitiveness in terms of the cost of services, the cost of bringing goods to the consumer. And the consumer could be an export market, of course. So in other words, just bringing things from, let's say, Sylhet to Chittagong, right, where it goes on the ship. It is also a massive source of employment, because in most modern logistics sectors, if you look at any decent-sized economy, you will see that millions of people are employed in the logistics space, right? From freight forwarding to the railways to the trucking fleets to the ancillary services to the IT that's involved and. So a massive area of growth, and in a complex economy and complex society and complex regulatory system like Bangladesh, it's wonderful news that the government has now elevated logistics to the level of a priority sector. So very excited about it. What are we doing in it? We are a potential investor. We are actually currently, as we speak, we're looking at, you already mentioned, cold chains and cold storage, that in a country like Bangladesh with the temperature challenges.
And it helps to build up other sectors too.
Yes, there is, of course, a massive need, for instance, for computer engineers, for more efficient trucking fleets, for electric vehicles, I mean, if one really thinks through it, if you think of logistics sort of as the arteries of the economy, you can link that to almost everything else that we're doing, right? And it even includes how to get patients to the hospital or how to get the right medical services to patients, right? So it's at the end of the day, it's massively important. And so again, happy to see that. We're currently studying the opportunity set because it's a fairly complex, it's almost like a Rubik's Cube. So there are areas that we think others will be better suited to assist with, maybe the World Bank, maybe the Asian Development Bank or others, of course also some local partners here. And there are other areas where we think we can really help to make a difference. And so we're looking at container port terminals, for instance. We're looking, just to give a few examples, we're looking at some big infrastructure. We're looking also at cold storage. I already mentioned that. Personally, I'm very excited about express freight. I think that's an overlooked sector here because just think of pharmaceuticals, where the country is a massively important producer. That is a space where, for instance, air freight can be very important for certain high value pharmaceuticals. So good opportunities, and we're currently studying that space, and we'll be announcing our priority areas. As always, for us, the best thing is when local entrepreneurs come to us and they say, oh, by the way, I'm interested in this or that sector. Would you mind thinking with us through what are the opportunities, what are the challenges, and possibly help us? So we're always open for business, and I have been learning massive amounts from our wonderful entrepreneurs in this country, and some of them are really focused now on logistics, so that's great news.
Now, the financial sector is the backbone of any economy, and Bangladesh is no different. But if you look at the financial sector currently, there is still room for improvement, especially in the case for NPLs. How can IFC help to improve the situation?
Back when I was in graduate school and studied economics, I was asked by my professor at the time to read the World Development Report 1989. Very, very old World Development Report. It is still being utilized a lot to show the importance of the financial sector for development. And the title of that World Development Report, which is the World Bank's flagship publication every year, was actually Finance for Development. Because over many decades, the financial sector had always been considered as just assisting everybody else, right? Sort of the oil in the engine, but not really as something that produces growth in itself. And the World Development Report in '89 actually showed that finance is important in its own right. And again, Bangladesh actually is a good example of that, because I think some of the growth of Bangladesh was helped by the existence of a thriving microfinance system that the country, of course, has been very famous for, the BRAC example, for instance. So finance is important. Second thing is, it's important especially right now. And in 2022, I was actually one of the co-authors of the 2022 World Development Report. And that one is called Finance for an Equitable Recovery. And that was looking at the history of COVID and how it affected the financial system and the availability of credit. And the report focuses on what steps do we need to take globally, but also at the country level, in order to ramp up the financial sector to help with growth. Now, you already mentioned that the financial sector here has some challenges. If you just look at the numbers, you will see that private sector credit to GDP is the lowest in the region and one of the lowest worldwide. It is there is at least a potential to grow it by 100% to even catch up with, let's say, the Indias of this world. So what we're seeing is that SMEs, for instance, get very little access to credit. I believe you yourself have been co-author of a recent a business climate report with MCCI, and that points out that access to finance is one of the.
It is the most challenging at the moment for businesses.
Absolutely, it is the key,
and especially for SMEs.
There you go.
Yes.
It is one of the key constraints to growth, and we see from the IFC side a similar story. There are banks that would like to do more in the SME space, and they're simply not doing it because they consider it too risky. We have interest rate caps. We have all kinds of things that make it hard to get there. Now, I think we're currently in fact, right now, as we speak, we're seeing a number of reform efforts by government and by BB, Bangladesh Bank, that are all moving in what I think a very positive direction. So one of is a somewhat more stringent NPL recognition, the adoption of IFRS 9 standards, some pressure to improve and increase capitalization of the banks, the adoption of the Banking Companies Act, a secure transactions reform, and last but not least, a risk-based bank supervision system. Almost all of these areas are issues and topics where IFC plays some role as an advisor, as a discussion partner. And then when it comes to our investment work, we have traditionally done a lot of investments in the financial sector. We helped to create two actually of the non-bank financial institutions. We were a founding shareholder of BRAC Bank. We are currently an investor in Citibank. We are ready to invest more and to put our capital in and put it at risk also. I think there are huge opportunities. In fact, I'm totally excited about that sector. I think I would predict there will be massive growth of the banking sector, notwithstanding that there will be some consolidation. So we probably see fewer banks in the future, but fewer and more efficient banks. I think we will also see some positive developments on capital markets. That's another space we're working on. We're currently discussing with government stakeholders a possibility of possibly issuing a local currency bond, which would help to create a bigger capital market. So I think there's a lot of efforts that are ongoing as we speak that will improve the playing field, make the financial system more efficient, and then enable it to really invest in the growth both of the existing formal economy, but then last but not least in the SME space, which in every country in the world provides about 80 to 90% of employment. And a growing economy like a big population like that of Bangladesh, first and foremost, needs jobs.
I know IFC is also working on affordable housing, and by affordable housing, we typically mean units that are about 600 square feet. Now, I was looking at an IFC report that said that every year there's a supply gap of 250,000 units. So this means that there is a huge untapped market here. What can be done to actually tap into this market?
So the housing market is clearly a massive potential growth area for the country. And we estimate that about 80% of Bangladeshis rent their housing. That is way above the international norm. There are, and of course, we still have a growing population that, by the way, you mentioned 600 square feet, that typically wants somewhat larger dwellings than 600 square feet, right? So we're probably talking more 800, 900, or even 1,000 square feet. That market opportunity is massive, especially when we keep in mind that there will also be internal migration. The World Bank's country climate development report that was recently published, I think it was in October, predicts that there may be, in the worst case, up to 10 or 12 million internal climate migrants.
13.5 million.
13.5 even.
Yeah.
Okay, so even bigger than what I remembered. So there will be a massive demand for additional housing, and we like to look at that massive demand as a big opportunity. So we've been discussing with both with the public sector and then also with the private sector on what we can do about that.
Yes.
And,
in fact, I was having a conversation with the private sector, the real estate developers on this, and they were saying that currently this is not feasible for them because since the cost of land is so high, it becomes unfeasible for them to make units that are quite small. So I was thinking about the opportunity for a PPP in this area where the government can essentially provide the land and the supporting infrastructure, and the private sector can bring in the rest.
I think you already provided the solution there in your question. That is indeed the way this needs to be done, which is we have sort of three elements to this equation, or it's kind of like a chair with three legs, otherwise it'll fall over. So one is, of course, availability of land. Without land, there won't be any massive,
housing, right?
Certainly no massive housing. I mean, we can use the existing land to build, for instance, somewhat higher buildings. That is usually also has some downsides. So we need the land. And that is, of course, where government and the public sector comes in. And then we need, on the supply side of housing, we need those developers. And we need also sustainable supply chains of sustainable housing materials. So that's something we're currently investigating. We've done a lot of work on that in India, and we're borrowing some of that experience to bring it here to Bangladesh.
What is the
now.
current scenario of sustainable construction materials right now in Bangladesh?
So currently, I would say there is a lot of room for improvement.
Oh, that's
to say it
good to know.
mildly.
Still an opportunity, like you said.
Yes. So one element, for instance, is to substitute the current use of bricks, which have, as we all know, anyone who travels in and out of Dhaka can see in front of their eyes just the environmental impact of that, with cinder blocks and cement, even though cement is also not unproblematic, but at least it's better than the brick production that we're seeing right now. There's other sustainable materials that one can use, and so we're currently looking at that and really trying to work with some of the manufacturers here to build these more sustainable supply chains. The third element is, of course, a demand element, and that is building a mortgage market, because we need to have affordable housing mortgages that essentially would allow people who currently are paying a monthly rent to make the equivalent payment on their mortgage, and then they acquire home ownership over time. And this is something that we're very excited about. We estimate a potential investment space over the next 10 years of at least $60 billion. So it's massive by any standard, not just Bangladeshi standards. It's a massive opportunity. We're working with stakeholders on the public sector side, but also with developers, and last but not least with the banks, on helping to improve their services and offerings in that space. One specific example is that last year we issued a housing bond together with BRAC, 50 million. That's a small drop in the bucket.
But that's still a start?
But it's a start,
yes.
Exactly. And we're actually seeing now, we're very happy about that, a lot of interest by other financial institutions to do something similar.
Okay, that's great to know. Now, Martin, we're going to discuss a very important topic, which is climate change. And to put the effects of climate change on development into perspective, I'm going to actually refer to the World Bank CCDR report that you mentioned. So it says that Bangladesh could have over 13 million internal climate migrants by 2050, and a third of the agriculture GDP is expected to be lost. Air pollution is costing 9% of GDP every year. And in the case of a severe flooding, GDP could fall as much as 9%. Now, this tells us that economic growth and development needs to be very climate smart. And we actually need to look into circular economy solutions, energy efficiency, and overall climate smart investment. So what's your take on this?
So in a nutshell, I agree with everything you just said. Bangladesh is really already and will be one of the most heavily affected countries from climate change. Here we can literally see it in front of our eyes, right? And of course the flooding is something that the Bengal region has dealt with for thousands of years, because of course there's always been the flood from the mountains and then counterweight by the flood from the sea, which actually has helped to produce some of the most fertile agricultural land in the world. So we should not complain about the flooding too much. But of course it's a risk. And then you already mentioned the other environmental risks, such as soil degradation, salination of soils, especially in the south. The fact that whole islands, recently saw a film about that, whole little islands are basically being flooded and people have to move. So that's where the migration comes into play. And then last but not least, something that personally I'm very worried about, which is the incredible level of air pollution here, which, depending on what source you read, may knock 6 years off the average Bangladeshi's life expectancy, including mine. So, it's something where I think we're all very, very concerned about and focused on. And I think one needs to keep in mind that these are problems that many other countries have dealt with over their development journey. When I grew up in Germany, you couldn't swim in any of the rivers, you couldn't eat any of the fish in the rivers because it was all poisonous. Now, about 45, 50 years later, has completely changed.
Now, what are some of the lessons learned that we can actually take from those countries?
So some of the lessons are, I think, really a collective focus on this issue. And as part of the sort of putting that into the DNA of who we are, right? So, and all development starts at the local level, and climate-friendly development starts at the local level. So it's planting trees in the cities. It's taking care of getting rid of our garbage in an environmentally more positive way. It starts with education, making sure that our children understand this, because they are the stewards of the future, right? They're the ones who will be much more affected by this than the current population, because we may still get away with not facing the biggest impacts of this massive climate change that we're witnessing. So education, in my view, is very important. PPP models are important, right? It's shown around the world that sometimes private sector players can do wastewater treatment in a more efficient way than the government can, or that garbage collection can be organized more efficiently, that separating the garbage into different categories for recycling can be organized very well. So we really need to think in a very integrated way. Personally, I think there's a lot of space for urban development by empowering cities here in this country to be more active, to have more power, frankly speaking, enforcement power over the rules. To give them also, allow them to have their own dedicated sources of revenue, instead of having to depend on handouts from the central government. I'm not a macroeconomist, but from my perspective as a private sector investor, I see huge potential. We already talked about agriculture. There are still massive efficiency gains in agriculture. So even as our available land shrinks, if we can compensate that by having a higher productivity on the remaining land, I think we should be fine. We also need to think about use of fertilizer instead of taking out, as the CCDR will show, instead of taking out material at the end of the season from the fields to burn for cooking. That alone reduces the fertilizer that we put in every year by 50%. So in other words, if we did not take out the organic material, we could reduce fertilizer use by 50%. That's huge. It's massive, right? So there are massive opportunities. And again, I'm very happy to see just how much innovation is happening by the private sector, including to grow crops that otherwise we import from elsewhere and grow them locally. And there's huge potential. And so I choose to be very positive about this. I actually think a crisis helps us to focus. It gives us urgency. And so in that sense, maybe it's even good that we're now also aware of this current climate crisis and we're beginning to really do something about it. And I just want to end that by saying I'm very impressed that Bangladesh made its own commitment under the COP agreements. It's one of the few developing countries that actually made their own commitment, even though, of course, Bangladesh was not the contributor to the climate crisis in the past. But I think it helps with the credibility, it helps to build goodwill, and it will make other countries want to come to Bangladesh and to learn from the experience.
It also talks about Bangladesh's vision towards climate change and how they're thinking about it. And of course, it helps to develop a roadmap towards sustainability, and also in the case of private sector and
Absolutely.
investment. Now, I would like to talk about the digital economy, and Bangladesh has all the fundamentals for a fully digital economy. We have 103 million internet users. Bangladesh is the 10th largest mobile market globally, and it is the second largest supplier of online labor globally also. Now, what are the specific opportunities available in digital economy space, you would think?
So I think at a certain level, Bangladesh is very lucky to be where it is as far as digital is concerned, right? Because of course the digital revolution we've all been witnessing that over the last couple of decades. And Bangladesh has everything going for it. The elements are there for a wonderful digital ecosystem. Bangladesh was one of the early adopters of mobile communications. As we said before, the country is completely covered. Smartphone usage is on the way up. We have, of course, the digital payments ecosystem. That was a space where I think Bangladesh Bank was an early adopter and actually a pioneer, even among other central banks. And so they were an enabler for what is now a world-class digital payments system with several very strong performers that compete against each other, thereby reducing the cost for the consumer. We have an increasingly well-educated population that is strong in the STEM space. I read somewhere that Bangladesh produces, I think it was 25,000 or 30,000 engineers every year. So that is a wonderful, workforce to rely upon. And then, of course, the language capabilities of Bangladeshis are a big advantage in a international business world that tends to be dominated by English-speaking companies. So there's a lot of things to be very proud about from the Bangladeshi point of view, and there are lots of things that will attract investors and investments. Personally, I'm very excited about the upcoming digital banking regulations. I think we will see a handful of digital banks. Yeah. So this will mean that banks will be moving towards hybrid models, and that we may even see non-traditional financial players, or that we will see players coming into the market that are not banks, but that will start offering banking services.
Through digital services, by their presence online.
Absolutely, yes. Sometimes these things are called neobanks in other countries. There's different names for this. Now, I don't know the regulations. They are still pending approval, but we have experience from other countries, like in the Philippines, where IFC has actually invested in a digital bank recently. We would love to invest in that space. We think that it helps with inclusion. It helps to bring down the cost of financial intermediation of operations, which benefits the consumer, because at the end of the day, if a bank is not efficient, that is paid for by the consumer, right? So because they have to pay higher fees or higher interest rates or whatever it may be. So I think we will reap some of those benefits with this evolving system. The other area that we're very enthusiastic about is e-commerce. As you know, there is a thriving e-commerce system here. In fact, we are aware of at least 1,200 companies that are in the digital space now that have been recently created just in this country alone. And in fact, just yesterday, I was part of an investment committee in IFC that approved an investment in a venture capital fund that has a specific target to invest here in the Bangladeshi disruptive technology space with some e-commerce providers, for instance. So there's a massive opportunity that is coming that will also attract big investments from outside. And again, I think Bangladesh has everything going for it. And as you know, some of the economic zones have been earmarked for ICT. So that will also provide, the space, also, for instance, for hosting.
We also have land allocated for our high-tech parks in Bangladesh.
There you go. Yes. So I think that's a very wise decision, because that in the future, we always need to think 20, 30 years ahead. It's almost like already thinking about the next generation. What will they be busy with? And so this is a massive growth area for the country. And again, we can take a few pages from the Philippines. I think if we compare our ICT services with those of the Philippines, we have a growth potential of at least 20 times of where we are right now in Bangladesh.
There is a huge potential
massive,
there then.
absolutely massive. And we as IFC are ready to invest. And in fact, we have already made a couple of investments in the e-commerce space. And of course, we're very proud to have been a shareholder in bKash for a long time. And we continue to play an active role as a shareholder and on the board of that company.
Okay. Martin, thank you so much for your wonderful insights. It has been lovely talking to you. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Faaria, for having me.
And that is all for today. Stay tuned for our next episode. We're going to have an exciting new guest.